Welcome to our In Focus discussion on the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's the world's first comprehensive civil rights law for persons with disabilities and expanded opportunities for this community to contribute to our global progress. The law helps shift perspectives from viewing these individuals as objects of charity to people with rights who are active, contributing members of society and capable of exercising those rights. Tonight, our guests will talk about their lived experiences, the progress that we've made as a society, and the work that still needs to be done. Kicking off our conversation tonight is Psarah Johnson, Board Chair for the Disabled Rights Action Committee. And Psarah, I know it was a busy day for you today. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having us on.
I want to learn more about this event that your organization hosted. Tell me what it was about and what came out of it.
You know, really, there's been a big push to make July Disability Pride Month across the nation. This was a huge step for us, having the ADA signed into law. And we're really looking for disability visibility more than anything. Our goal tonight was to really spotlight the arts. So we had a number of performers, dancers, aerialists, visual artists coming forward, all folks with disabilities, showing that there is beauty and strength to be had even when you are living with a disability.
Did you perform by chance?
I did not perform. I emceed a little bit. I have performed at several of our events in the past. But we really wanted to make sure that we highlighted a whole range of disabilities. It goes beyond just your typical curb cut or the elevator access you have. This goes into making sure you have translation services for the deaf and the hard of hearing. We want to make sure that the blind and visually impaired are also included. We are starting to understand more about sensory accessibility for people on the neurodivergent spectrum. So the ADA was a really great basic stepping stone, but we're not anywhere closer to accessibility for all.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this conversation. I'd like to talk about language. Something that sort of confuses some people in their journey to become allies is, when do I use person first language versus identity first language? It's sort of a tricky road to navigate sometimes. What would you say to those individuals that want to know?
You know, there is no straight correct answer. It depends on where the individual is in their journey and how they themselves identify. Many people within the disability rights movement are proud of their disabilities, and they claim their disability as part of their culture, part of who they are. But there are other people that want to be seen first and foremost as an individual. They don't want the disability to take center stage. I've found that the best way you can interact is find out what that person is most comfortable with.
Just
and
ask.
Yes.
Just ask, right?
Yeah, so person first language is a person with a disability. Identity first language, I refer to myself as a disabled woman. And when you make those mistakes, it's okay. Move on. You don't have to make a big deal of it. You don't have to say you're sorry. Just acknowledge, and next time try to do better.
I love that. Thank you for answering that question. Today is the 31st anniversary of the ADA. You touched on this a little bit earlier in this conversation. Let's dive into it. How are you reflecting today?
You know, this is a huge deal for me. I was born back in the 70s before we had the ADA. And I very clearly remember my mother fighting for just basic access for me. Before the ADA, what accessibility looked like was putting me in a classroom on the main floor. In 5th grade, I was advanced into the high reading class, but that high reading class was on the 2nd story of the building. Instead, they put me down to low reading, and my accommodation became to post into a lower class. By the time I got to high school and the ADA had passed, they had to make those special accommodations, and they had to find ways that if I wasn't able to take a class, that class would move to me. That's the big difference that we saw in the ADA. It's not about making do with what I can do. It's about meeting me where my needs are and making sure I can excel at that higher level.
Wow, so you've been able to see the ADA from its inception and the impact that it's had after that. That's incredible. Tell me about your organization's project to fight for fair housing in Utah.
Fair housing is a huge issue. We are seeing this as we see more and more townhomes being built across the city. It can be a major frustration. Those townhomes are not built with a lot of access for people like myself, and we're really trying to encourage a lot of people to understand what we call visitability. The idea of visitability is that you should be able to at least access someone's main living space and utilize a bathroom. That's the basic level for access to a house. There are a lot of organizations out there that are working with people with disabilities to make sure that they can modify their homes. I myself, we just moved into a new house, and I had a number of different ability organizations come in, Assist being one of them. They'll map out your house for you and really help you figure out what's going to be the best thing for you. Again, there is no one way to make a home accessible.
You have individual needs, and therefore you should look at it on an individual basis.
Yes.
Sarah, we have to wrap. I want to squeeze this question in real quick. How can someone support people with disabilities in their journey as an ally?
I think the biggest deal is showing up, learning about them, and like your team today, when I came on, they were willing to meet me where I was and accept the help that I needed.
Shout out to our floor crew. Thank you so much, Sarah. You've been hearing from Psarah Johnson. She is the board chair for the Disabled Rights Action Committee. And Sarah, we enjoyed having you here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Up next in our discussion is Jim Browns, board member for the Disabled Rights Action Committee. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rosie.
Jim, I'd like to start our conversation with talking about how you're reflecting as we celebrate the 31st anniversary of the ADA today.
It's meant a lot to me. I became disabled after I got multiple sclerosis back in about 2013, but it took me years to admit that I was disabled because of the huge stigma. And Disability Pride Month has meant a lot to me because I can finally just own that identity. That means a lot.
I love that. Can you talk a little bit about that process? So July is Disability Pride Month, and you talked a little bit about how that's helped you own your disability.
I used to work in information technology. I worked for a startup company, an incredibly competitive environment, and being unable to perform any kind of work was basically a death sentence at that kind of environment. And so when I started to get sick, when my multiple sclerosis decided to express itself, I was absolutely panicked that I would no longer meet the standards that I needed to be there. And it took me a long, long time to get comfortable with the fact that, you know what, I don't get to do that anymore. Then that's fine. I now have another focus, because I realized after becoming disabled how hard it is for disabled people to do anything and participate in the world at all, and realized there was a lot of justice to struggle for there.
Thank you for sharing that. Jim, what are your thoughts on the health and medical care that's being provided to people with disabilities in our country?
It is sadly lacking. I mean, we are the wealthiest country in the world, and yet we can't provide basic care to even to all of our citizens like most every other industrialized country in the world. The disabled community is, in my experience, having worked dealing with Social Security for 7 years, is basically left to hang and struggle and hope for the best. So that is shameful. It's like, why can billionaires afford to go to space, and yet we can't give people the most basic care and let them feel like human beings?
So this next question I'm going to ask you may seem to have an obvious answer. Do you think we're having enough conversations about the disability community, or are we having the right conversations about our disability community?
We are starting to have the right conversations because the disabled are becoming more and more visible. You're starting to see people talk about disability and accessibility in a way that they didn't before. The recent publicity of what's happened to Britney Spears is actually a major thing that we've major motivation point for us, because we realized, oh wait, we can talk about conservatorship now. Now it's a word that everybody uses. So that particular thing is basically taking away the civil rights of the disabled and the elderly for no other reason than someone else wants to control their money, which is absolute garbage if you ask me.
I know this is a cause so personal to you, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. What are some of the misconceptions that still exist for people with disabilities, and how do you want to address those?
The misconceptions in a lot of ways, and they are certainly misconceptions that I had, were that, and are, that the disabled can't contribute in any way, that we don't have anything to say, that maybe our voices simply don't need to be heard because we can't express ourselves in the way that other people can, or we don't have the capability of giving people things that they're expecting to see. We're simply not, we're not here just to inspire people, for people to go, oh my gosh, that's so inspiring. It's like, no, we're a person. I'm a person. Let me be a person. Let me just be like anyone else in the world. That's all we really want. So, and if we can get to that point, and if publicity of issues that affect us can get us to that point, that would be a huge benefit. So the presence of the disabled in the media and the attention that we're getting is better, but we need more. We need to work harder and to see more people.
Definitely a lot of food for thought there. Jim, we have about 30 seconds left. Want to ask you the same question I asked Psarah. How can people better serve or better be an ally to the disability community?
Don't look away when one of us comes down the street. If you see someone walking down the street with a cane, don't just cringe like I get all the time. Don't just look like you're afraid this could happen to you, because quite frankly, it could. It could happen to anyone in a split second. I never planned to get multiple sclerosis, but it happened. And that's no reason for someone to be afraid of me. It's not like they can get it by walking next to me. So just treat us like a regular person. Treat us like a person. That would be a big plus.
I don't think you could have said it better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosie.
You've been hearing from Jim Brown's board member for the Disabled Rights Action Committee. Jim, it was so great to have you here tonight. Thank you for being a part of this discussion.
Thank you for having me, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Rounding out our conversation tonight is Tiquani Oliver, board member for the Disabled Rights Action Committee. Tiquani, welcome back to the show. It's always great to have you. I'd like to start our discussion tonight with asking you, what are your thoughts about the current grade school curriculum that's been debated across the country as well as here in Utah? How does that impact our community members with disabilities?
Well, I'd like to first say thank you for having me back again. It's always a pleasure. First off, I'd like to let's start back by actually talking about what it was. And we weren't debating changing the core curriculum for the state of Utah. There's been a debate that unfortunately has been created that's a non-issue, because no one's looking at changing the core curriculum. What they are looking at was educating, it's called equity and diversity training for our educators, which it's really sad that our conservative lawmakers took so much time and so much of our taxpayer dollars in talking about a non-issue, when really we could have talked about, they could have spoken about what's actually in the curriculum for educators. Equity, diversity, talking about how ways that our teachers and our educators could be more empathetic to our students, not just of any particular race, but also of different backgrounds, including those of the, and especially those of the disability community.
This is a subject we've been talking about for quite some time through all of our shows, so thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Talk to us about where people with disabilities are in the conversation when it comes to municipal and private development projects.
I think the conversation is really far behind. There's a lot of municipal programs and city development that we're completely left out of the conversation, because sometimes even accessing our municipal service to talk to um, our community leaders like our city councilmen, sometimes that website can be a little bit difficult to navigate. And I know, for example, our Utah Inland Port is a big project that Salt Lake is taking on right now. And a lot of us with invisible disabilities like asthma, um, and also various pulmonary diseases, it's affecting them in their invisible disabilities, and no one's putting them to the table when these projects are being planned and developed and negotiated behind closed doors.
It's a good issue that you bring up. Tiquani, today is the 31st anniversary of the ADA. What are your thoughts when it comes to accessibility?
We're still so far behind. Sadly, communities and business leaders don't take the lead in these sorts of issues because they see the disabled community as a burden rather than how much not tax dollars, how much we as disabled folks, actually the buying power that we have as a community. And so we're still far, far behind, because rather than seeing us as potential, they're still seeing us a barrier when really we should be included all along.
Now, we've made a lot of progress, but like you said, there are some things that we as a society still need to work on. What are some improvements that you would like to see us work on?
A lot of the improvements that when we create city planning, whether it's pedestrian areas, we should also keep in mind the dual purpose pedestrian areas for folks who are in mobility devices, and creating those public spaces that make it accessible for all, not simply just people who are walking, but folks who have multiple mobility devices and aids and things like that.
And Tiquani, for those who are allies or working on becoming an ally, what would you like them to think about when it comes to disabilities?
One of the main things is how they speak to those who are disabled and the words that they use. Oftentimes, a lot of the insults that are flying around in our vernacular get thrown around, and we often forget that those words came from a background of marginalizing and exploiting the disabled. And so that's one of the things, is learning our words and figuring out those things before we speak to the community, of really unpacking that ableistic language in their everyday speak.
Well said. You've been hearing from Tiquani Oliver, board member for the Disabled Rights Action Committee. And Tiquani, thanks for being a part of our conversation. It was great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. We invite you to join our Facebook group by going to facebook.com/group/ABC4InFocus, or you can send us an email, infocus@abc4.com.